The desert sun was merciless that afternoon, baking the asphalt of Interstate 15 into a shimmering ribbon of heat. Sergeant Megan Holt was heading home from a training seminar in San Diego, her truck loaded with dusty gear and the faint scent of engine oil. The highway stretched endlessly through the Mojave, her only companions the distant hum of traffic and the rhythm of country music murmuring through her speakers. Then it happened, a sound so sudden it sliced through the quiet like a gunshot. A deafening boom, followed by a plume of black smoke rising ahead. Her instincts, sharpened by years in the Marine Corps, snapped to life before her mind caught up. She slammed on the brakes, tires screeching against the blistered road. Drivers began pulling over, some stepping out of their cars, pointing, gasping. About 100 yards ahead, a sedan had flipped onto its roof, flames licking from the hood, its metal body groaning like a wounded animal. Megan flung open her door, heat hitting her face like an open furnace. "Someone call 911. She shouted. But most people just stood frozen, clutching their phones, filming, staring, the way bystanders often do when reality becomes too unbearable to process. Without hesitation, she sprinted forward. The air was thick with smoke and gasoline fumes that stung her eyes and clawed at her throat. The roar of the fire drowned out everything, even her own heartbeat. As she neared the wreck, she heard it, a voice. Weak, hoarse, terrified. "Help. Please, I can't move." Megan dropped to her knees beside the shattered window, squinting through the heat haze. Inside was a young man in a Marine uniform, his face streaked with blood and soot, his leg twisted beneath the crumpled dashboard. For a brief moment, time froze. She saw the fear in his eyes, not just the fear of dying, but of dying alone. "Hang on, Marine," she shouted. "I've got you." Her hands moved fast. She tried the door, but it wouldn't budge. The handle was melted, the metal warped by heat. She ran to the other side, pulling, kicking, using every ounce of her strength. Still nothing. The flames were growing louder, hungrier, swallowing the back seat. She ran back to her truck, threw open the tailgate, and grabbed a crowbar from her toolkit. When she returned, smoke was pouring through the cracks, the young Marine coughing violently. "Please," he rasped. "I don't want to die here." "You won't," she promised. With one hard swing, she smashed the side window, glass raining down in 1,000 glittering shards. The heat poured out like an open oven. She reached inside, ignoring the sting on her arms, and hooked the crowbar under the crushed frame. "Come on," she growled through gritted teeth, prying it open inch by inch until she could wedge herself halfway in. "Can you move your arms?" she yelled. He nodded weakly. Legs stuck. "All right, I'm getting you out." She braced her shoulder against the dashboard, pushing with all her might. It groaned, shifted slightly, just enough for him to pull his leg free with a cry of pain. Megan looped an arm under his shoulders, dragging him out as flames roared behind them. The soles of her boots began to stick to the melting asphalt. Halfway out, the young Marine's body went limp. "Stay with me?" she shouted, shaking him. "You're not quitting on me now." She dragged him completely free, gasping for breath, her lungs screaming from smoke inhalation. The fire was now a raging monster, devouring the entire vehicle. And then the explosion came. A thunderous blast ripped through the air, sending both of them flying. Megan hit the ground hard, gravel slicing her cheek. For a moment, there was nothing but ringing in her ears. No sound, no movement, just white light and pain. When her vision cleared, she saw the young Marine lying motionless a few feet away. Crawling toward him, she pressed trembling fingers to his neck. A faint pulse. He was alive. Relief crashed over her like a wave. Behind them, the wreck burned itself out, the flames now stretching toward the desert sky. Other drivers finally approached, their faces pale with shock. Someone handed her a wet cloth. Another tried to help lift the Marine's legs. But Megan waved them back. "He's mine," she said quietly. She tore off her jacket and draped it over him, shielding him from the sun. His breathing was shallow but steady. She sat there beside him, her burned hands trembling, her body shaking from adrenaline. Her throat ached from smoke, but she stayed silent, eyes fixed on the distant wail of sirens approaching fast. Minutes stretched into eternity. The highway, once filled with noise, was now eerily silent. Every driver watched, no one spoke. When the paramedics arrived, they swarmed around the young Marine, cutting away his uniform, shouting medical jargon Megan could barely follow. One of them looked up at her hands, red and blistered. "You need to be treated too," he said. "I'm fine," she whispered, though she clearly wasn't. As they loaded him into the ambulance, the Marine's eyes fluttered open. He looked at her weakly, recognition flickering in his gaze. "You pulled me out," he said faintly. "Yeah," Megan said, forcing a smile. "That's what Marines do." He tried to smile back, but his lips trembled. "Don't. Let me die." "You won't," she said. "You've got my word." The doors closed, the ambulance roared away, and Megan finally felt the weight of it all. Her legs gave out beneath her, and she sank to the ground, the smell of burning rubber still hanging in the air. A highway patrol officer approached, asking her to step aside, but she couldn't move. Her eyes stayed locked on the trail of the departing ambulance until it vanished beyond the hills. Only then did she look down at her palms. They were scorched, blistered, and trembling. A small price, she thought, for someone else's tomorrow. The officer asked for her statement, but her mind was already far away. She kept seeing his face, the fear, the pleading, the trust in his final words. As the sun dipped behind the horizon, she finally rose, brushing dirt from her uniform. The wreck had been extinguished, the road partially cleared, the smell of burnt rubber replaced by a faint chemical haze. When she returned to her truck, her reflection in the window startled her. Soot-blackened face, reddened eyes, and a strand of hair singed nothing. She looked like someone else, someone reborn in fire. She sat in silence for a long time before turning the ignition. The radio had gone quiet, static crackling through the speakers. Outside, the last embers of the wreck glowed faintly against the desert dusk. As she pulled back onto the highway, her hands trembled against the steering wheel. But her eyes, though tired, burned with quiet resolve. She didn't know his name yet, didn't know if he'd live through the night. All she knew was this: she hadn't been ready to face the flames again after leaving the Corps. But somehow, the fire had found her anyway. And in that crucible of heat and fear, Sergeant Megan Holt had rediscovered the one truth every Marine learns the hard way. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision to move forward, even when fear is all you can feel. Then came the beeping, slow, rhythmic, like a mechanical heartbeat. She tried to move, but pain shot through her ribs and up her spine. For a moment, she didn't know where she was, or even who she was. Only the smell of antiseptic and the hiss of an oxygen line told her she was still alive. When her eyes opened, the world swam into focus. White ceiling tiles, fluorescent lights, a curtain half drawn, the faint murmur of voices down the hall. A hospital. She blinked twice, fighting to remember the fire, the explosion, the young Marine's voice. It all felt like a fever dream. A nurse noticed she was awake and hurried over. "Easy now, Sergeant Holt," she said softly. "You're safe. You're at San Bernardino Memorial." Megan tried to ask what happened, but her throat burned as if she'd swallowed sand. The nurse lifted a cup with a straw to her lips. The first sip of water felt like sunlight in her veins. Smoke inhalation, the nurse explained, checking her vitals. And some nasty burns on your hands and forearms. But you're lucky. Everyone thought you wouldn't make it through the night. Megan let the words drift past her. The boy, she rasped finally. The Marine, is he? The curtain slid open before the nurse could answer. A tall man in dress blues stepped in, square-jawed, metals gleaming, his expression a careful mix of pride and sorrow. Sergeant Holt, he said quietly. I'm Colonel Travis Dunn, base liaison for Camp Pendleton. He removed his cover and stood at attention. Ma'am, you saved Private Logan Reeves. Pulled him clear seconds before the car detonated. If you hadn't acted... His voice trailed off, heavy with implication. Megan's breath caught. The memory slammed back in pieces. The crowbar, the fire, his cry for help. He's alive. Yes, ma'am. Critical, but alive. He's been asking for you since surgery. Relief swept through her so hard it made her dizzy. She sank back against the pillow, tears slipping sideways into her hairline. Good, she whispered. That's good. The colonel glanced at her chart, then back at her blistered hands. You should rest. The docs say you took in enough smoke for 2 people. But when you're stable, Private Reeves would like to see you. Megan nodded weakly. Tell him I'll be there. The following day crawled by in a blur of morphine haze and shallow breaths. Nurses came and went, checking burns, changing dressings, muttering about how lucky she was. Megan stared out the narrow hospital window at the desert horizon. Every sunset out there looked like a battlefield on fire, orange, red, fading to ash. She kept thinking of Logan Reeves. What kind of kid enlists straight out of high school? Drives alone through the desert in uniform. She'd seen hundreds like him during her service, young, fearless, convinced the world would bend to their will until reality reminded them it wouldn't. By mid-afternoon, the nurse returned with news. Private Reeves is out of surgery and conscious. He's in room 212, if you're feeling up for it. Megan tried to sit up. Pain stabbed through her chest, but she refused to stay down. Wheelchair, she ordered. Now. Within minutes, she was being pushed through sterile hallways that smelled of bleach and coffee. The wheels squeaked softly over the linoleum. Her pulse quickened as they stopped outside 212. When the nurse opened the door, the beeping monitors and smell of disinfectant hit her again, but so did the sight of him. Logan lay propped up on a pillow, pale but alive. His head was bandaged, his arm in a sling. He looked impossibly young, freckles scattered across soot-streaked cheeks. When his eyes found hers, they widened with recognition. You're real, he whispered hoarsely. Megan chuckled softly. So are you, Private. That's a start. He smiled, weak but genuine. You saved me. She shook her head. You saved yourself. I just gave you a shove. For a while, they just looked at each other, survivor to survivor. And Logan spoke again, voice trembling. They said the car blew right after you pulled me clear. Why'd you come back? Megan stared at her burned hands. Because that's what Marines do. We don't leave anyone behind. He swallowed hard, eyes glassy. Even off-duty? Especially off-duty. They both laughed then, a brittle, healing sound that cracked the tension in the room. Over the next 2 days, Megan visited often. She learned that Logan was 20, from Omaha, the only child of a single mother who worked nights at a diner. He'd just finished basic training and was driving back to base after a short leave. His car had blown a tire, swerved, and rolled. Fate, chaos, coincidence, whatever you called it, their lives had collided at exactly the right second. He asked about her service, and she told him pieces Afghanistan, rescue operations, the day she decided to retire because the memories were getting too heavy. "Do you ever stop hearing the noise?" he asked once. She smiled sadly. "No, but you learn to live with the echoes." That night, as she prepared to leave his room, Logan reached for her wrist. His fingers were cold but strong. "Promise me something." "What's that?" "When I can walk again," he said, voice steady now, "we'll both stand tall. No matter what." Megan's throat tightened. "That a challenge, Private?" "A pact," he said, smiling faintly. She squeezed his hand. "Deal." The next morning, she woke to the sound of rain against the window, rare desert rain that fell like forgiveness. Her doctor cleared her for discharge within a day, warning her to rest. She packed slowly, wincing as gauze stuck to her palms. The nurse who helped her sign papers said, "You'll get a commendation, you know." Local news already picked up the story. Megan forced a smile. "I didn't do it for that." "I know," the nurse said softly. "That's why it matters." Before leaving, Megan rolled her chair down the hall toward Logan's room one last time. He was sleeping, chest rising evenly beneath the thin blanket. She didn't wake him. She just stood there in the doorway, watching the steady rise and fall, the proof that he was still here. "Stand tall, Marine," she whispered. Then she turned and wheeled away. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the parking lot gleaming like polished glass. She climbed into her truck with careful hands, started the engine, and sat there for a long moment. The radio was still tuned to the same country station she'd been listening to before the crash. And as if the universe had a sense of irony, the singer's voice crooned through the static. "Some heroes never wear their medals, but their stories never fade." Megan laughed softly through the ache in her chest. She wasn't sure she believed in heroes. She believed in moments, brief flashes of choice, where someone decided to act. As she pulled onto the highway, a convoy of Marines passed in the opposite lane, their Humvees spraying puddles across the asphalt. She slowed instinctively, saluting through the windshield. The lead driver noticed, flashed his headlights, and saluted back. For the first time since the explosion, Megan felt something close to peace. She didn't know that within days, that peace would shatter, that a single phone call would pull her back into the heart of tragedy. But for now, the world was quiet, the road stretching endless and forgiving beneath the gray desert sky. She tightened her grip on the wheel, glanced once in the rearview mirror toward the hospital disappearing behind her, and whispered to herself the promise she'd made. "We'll both stand tall." For the first time in weeks, Sergeant Megan Holt's apartment felt too quiet. The rhythmic hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the wall clock, even the soft chirping of crickets outside, all of it seemed to echo around her like ghosts of memory. She sat at her small kitchen table, staring at her bandaged hands, still raw and red beneath the gauze. It had been 4 days since she'd left the hospital. 4 days since she'd last seen Logan Reeves. Yet his face, pale, soot-streaked, and smiling faintly through pain, refused to leave her thoughts. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard his words again. "When I can walk again, we'll both stand tall." She'd laughed then, thinking it was just something a kid said to make sense of trauma. But the tone in his voice, steady, certain, had stuck with her. There was something about him, something familiar in his stubborn will to survive. By the 5th day, she couldn't take it anymore. She called the hospital, pretending she needed to check on a patient's discharge information, though everyone knew what she really meant. The nurse on duty smiled through the phone. "Private Reeves is stable. He's been moved to a recovery ward for physical therapy. Keeps asking if you're coming back." Megan hesitated for a moment, looking at her scarred palms. She didn't feel like a hero. She felt broken, worn, smaller than she used to be. but something deep inside whispered that promises weren't meant to be half-kept. 2 hours later, she was back on the road. When she entered his room, Logan's face lit up instantly. He was sitting upright this time, both legs braced in casts, and 4 still in his arm, but his smile stronger than ever. "You came back," he said, voice warm with disbelief. Megan grinned. "You think I'd skip out on a fellow Marine?" He laughed, and for a moment, the sterile hospital walls didn't feel so suffocating. She pulled up a chair beside his bed, careful with her still healing hands. They talked for hours, about everything and nothing. Logan told her about growing up in Omaha, about working nights at a gas station just to afford his first car, about how he'd wanted to join the Marines since he was 10, after watching his father's funeral, a man who'd served in Iraq and never come home. "I thought if I joined, I'd understand him better," Logan said quietly. "But sometimes I think I just wanted to feel close to him." Megan nodded. "You'd be surprised how many of us joined for the same reason, to fill an empty space someone left behind." He smiled faintly. "What about you? Why'd you join?" She looked down at her hands. "Because I was tired of being afraid of the world. The Corps made me stronger, even when it broke me." Logan studied her face for a moment, as if memorizing it. "I hope I can be like that one day." "You already are," she said. Over the next week, Megan visited him daily. Sometimes she brought coffee, sometimes she just brought silence. They'd sit side by side, watching sunlight crawl across the tile floor. She started noticing the little things about him. How he clenched his jaw when frustrated during therapy. How his humor surfaced when others might have given up. And though she would never say it aloud, Megan felt something awakening in her too. Not romance, but something deeper. A sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. On her 8th visit, she found him sitting in a wheelchair, hands gripping the rims tightly. A therapist stood nearby, guiding him toward parallel bars. "You ready, Marine?" the therapist asked. Logan nodded. Born ready. Megan stayed at the doorway, watching as he strained to lift himself from the chair. His face twisted in pain, sweat glistening on his forehead. His leg trembled violently, the muscles refusing to obey. He fell back into the chair with a sharp breath. "Again," he said. "Logan, maybe take a break," I said again. Megan stepped forward. "He's not going to stop until he does it," she told the therapist. "It's a Marine thing." Logan grinned weakly. "Exactly." This time, with every ounce of strength, he pushed upward, arms shaking, chest heaving, and stood. Wobbly, unsteady, but standing. The therapist steadied him, and Megan clapped once, softly, a proud smile breaking across her face. He managed 2 shaky steps before collapsing back into the chair, exhausted but triumphant. "Not bad," Megan said, crouching beside him. "Told you you'd stand tall." He chuckled between breaths. "Guess I'm halfway there?" "Halfway's further than most get," she said gently. That night, as she left the hospital, the air outside felt cool and clean, the kind of evening where the stars seemed almost close enough to touch. She stood in the parking lot for a long time, looking up, realizing how long it had been since she'd felt peace. The next day, she returned again, this time with a small cardboard box. Logan raised an eyebrow. "What's this?" She opened it to reveal a pair of worn but polished Marine dress shoes. "You'll need these when you walk out of here," she said. He laughed softly. "You think I'll fit into them?" "You will," she said with a grin. "They belong to my last CO. He said to pass them to someone who earned them." Logan stared at the shoes for a long time, his eyes glistening. "You're serious?" "Dead serious." He nodded slowly. "Then I better live up to them." Their bond grew stronger over the days that followed. Other patients and nurses began to notice it. The way Megan's presence seemed to charge the room with quiet energy. The way Logan's recovery accelerated whenever she was near. He began to joke again, calling her Sarge instead of ma'am. She called him Boot, teasingly, like any senior Marine would a recruit. But behind the humor, both of them knew something unspoken tied them together. Not romance, but shared trauma. The fire had burned away the distance between them. One evening, as a storm rolled in over the desert, thunder rattling the hospital windows, Logan looked at her and said quietly, "You know, I think that explosion didn't kill me for a reason." "Oh?" "Yeah, maybe it was, so I could remind someone else how to live again." Megan blinked, caught off guard. "You think that's me?" He smiled faintly. "You tell me." She laughed softly. "You're too young to be this philosophical." He shrugged. "Guess dying once matures a guy." The next morning, she came early. The sun was just breaking over the horizon, the hospital corridors quiet. She found him asleep, the shoes she'd given him resting neatly on the knitstand. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe he'd walk out of here. That maybe his promise wasn't just words. She touched his shoulder gently before leaving, whispering, "You'll stand tall, Logan. I'll be there when you do." He stirred slightly, eyes fluttering but not waking. She smiled, slipped out of the room, and didn't see the nurse entering moments later with a worried look. By the time the call came 2 days later, the one that shattered her, Megan was back at home, cleaning her dress blues. A voice on the other end trembled as it spoke. "Sergeant Holt, this is Dr. Alvarez from San Bernardino Memorial. I'm so sorry to tell you. Private Reeves passed away this morning. Post-surgical infection. He was asking for you right before it happened." The phone slipped from her hand, clattering to the floor. For a long time, she sat in silence, staring at the empty shoes by her door. And somewhere deep in her chest, the echo of his promise returned. "When I can walk again, we'll both stand tall." The phone's dial tone hummed like static in Megan Holt's ears. She sat frozen on her couch, staring into nothing, her mind refusing to process the words that had just shattered her quiet morning. The sunlight streaming through the blinds seemed cruelly bright, too alive, too indifferent to loss. Private Logan Reeves was gone. The hospital's sterile hallways, his laugh, the promise in his voice. All of it now existed only in memory. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the shoes she'd given him, still sitting neatly by her door. She pressed her palm against the worn leather, as if trying to feel his heartbeat through them. And then the tears came. Not the loud, dramatic kind, but the silent, suffocating sobs that steal the air from your lungs. The kind soldiers are trained to hide. For hours, she sat there, wrapped in the heavy stillness of her apartment, replaying every conversation, every laugh, every word he'd said. When the Corps loses one of its own, they always say, "Semper Fi," always faithful. But Megan realized that faith doesn't stop the ache. It only teaches you how to live with it. 2 days later, a call from Logan's commanding officer confirmed what she already knew. The funeral would be held at Camp Pendleton. Full honors. His mother had requested Megan attend. At first, she hesitated. She didn't know if she could face it. The folded flag, the gunfire, the hollow echo of taps. But she owed him that much. He'd fought to stand tall again. She couldn't run from standing beside him one last time. She ironed her dress blues in silence. Every crease was precise, every ribbon placed with care. When she pinned on her medals, she hesitated at one, the Navy and Marine Corps Medal, awarded for acts of heroism in non-combat situations. It was the same medal she'd earned for pulling Logan from that burning Humvee. She stared at it, fingers trembling. "Guess it's yours now, kid," she whispered, brushing away a tear. The morning of the funeral broke gray and misty. A low fog clung to the hills as the convoy rolled through the gates of Camp Pendleton. Megan sat quietly in the back seat of the government sedan, her eyes fixed on the folded flag resting beside her. Rows of Marines stood in formation on the parade ground, their uniforms crisp, their boots shining like glass. The sound of the ocean carried faintly on the wind. As she stepped out, the air seemed to shift. Conversations stilled. A few Marines recognized her immediately, the sergeant who dragged a young private from the flames weeks earlier. They saluted her quietly, their eyes filled with a respect that made her chest ache even more. Logan's mother, a petite woman with kind eyes, met her near the casket. She looked fragile, yet there was a certain strength in her trembling hands. "You must be Sergeant Holt," she said softly. "Logan. He talked about you all the time." Megan swallowed hard. "He saved me as much as I saved him, Mom." The woman's eyes glistened. "He said you gave him hope. Thank you for that." Megan wanted to speak, but the words caught in her throat. All she could do was nod. As the ceremony began, a Marine chaplain stepped forward, voice steady against the soft hum of the wind. He spoke of duty, courage, sacrifice. Words Megan had heard at too many funerals, but somehow they felt different this time. They were about him. Each sentence was another weight pressing against her chest. When the rifle volley cracked through the silence, 3 precise shots, she flinched, the sound cutting through her like the echo of that explosion. Her eyes locked on the casket, draped in the flag she'd nearly died protecting. Logan's name gleamed faintly on the brass plate. Private First Class Logan M. Reeves, United States Marine Corps. A Marine honor guard approached. The slow, deliberate folding of the flag began. Every crease was measured, every motion exact, as if the entire corps were holding its breath. When the final corner was tucked, the flag was handed to the officer in charge, who knelt before Logan's mother. On behalf of the President of the United States, the Commandant of the Marine Corps, and a grateful nation. Megan's vision blurred. She could barely hear the rest. The mother's trembling hands clutched the flag as though it were her son himself. After the ceremony, Megan lingered by the rows of white headstones. The Marines had begun to disperse, their boots crunching softly on the gravel. The air was heavy with the smell of rain and salt. She knelt beside Logan's grave, tracing his name carved in the fresh marble. "Hey, Boot," she whispered, forcing a small smile. "You made it. You're standing tall now, just like you said you would." Her hand rested over the stone for a long moment. Then she reached into her pocket and placed something beside it. Her medal, the one she'd worn that morning. "You earned this more than I ever did." A tear rolled down her cheek, landing on the metal surface. And then, slowly, her vision began to swim. At first, she thought it was just the heat, or maybe exhaustion. But the edges of the world started to blur, and her knees trembled. The low murmur of voices faded, replaced by a rushing in her ears like distant waves. "Megan?" Someone called from behind her. She turned, tried to answer, but the ground tilted beneath her. The last thing she saw before the darkness took her was the neat line of Marines pivoting sharply toward her, boots striking the earth in unison. She collapsed. When consciousness returned, it came in fragments, sound first, then light. A soft wind brushed against her face. Somewhere nearby, a bugle was playing a faint echo of taps. Her eyelids fluttered open, and for a moment she thought she was dreaming. She was lying on the ground, the sky stretched wide above her, and surrounding her on all sides, like a sea of silent strength, were Marines. Hundreds of them. Every one of them stood at attention, faces solemn, hands raised in a slow, unified salute. Someone knelt beside her, a lieutenant, his voice low and steady. "Easy, Sergeant Holt. You're safe." She tried to speak, but her throat was dry. "What?" Happened? You went down, ma'am, he said softly. Exhaustion, dehydration. But you're gonna be okay. She blinked, still dazed, trying to comprehend the sight before her. The rows of Marines, not moving, not speaking, just standing there in perfect silence, honoring her as they had Logan. It wasn't ceremony. It wasn't protocol. It was family. The lieutenant's voice lowered even further. Private Reeves's mother asked us to do this, said you deserved to be honored beside her son. We couldn't agree more. For the first time in weeks, Megan smiled, faintly through the tears. She looked up at the hundreds of Marines standing still in the mist, their silhouettes outlined by the pale California sun. And in that moment, she realized something. This wasn't the end of Logan's story, or hers. It was the moment his promise came true. They both stood tall. The fog of exhaustion and grief lingered long after Megan Holt was lifted from the parade ground. Her body ached in ways she hadn't felt in years. Every muscle stiff, every joint screaming protest. Yet it wasn't just physical. Her heart was still trapped in that moment. The weight of Logan Reeves's absence. The sight of hundreds of Marines standing at silent attention. And the echo of his promise whispering in her mind, "We'll both stand tall." Even hours later, as she lay on the hospital bed in the infirmary, the image of the Marines remained vivid. Thousands of eyes on her, every salute unbroken, a tribute beyond words. The memory made her chest tighten and her lungs burn. She realized, perhaps for the first time, that heroism wasn't about medals or recognition. It was about the decisions made in the instant when someone's life hangs by a thread and choosing to act anyway. A nurse approached, checking her vitals. "You're lucky, Sergeant Holt," she said softly. "Most people wouldn't survive what you went through. Not mentally, not physically." Megan turned her head, eyes hollow. "Lucky doesn't feel like a word for this," she whispered. "I should have. You saved him. You saved his life, and probably more than a few others indirectly. That's not luck. That's courage." The nurse's words were kind, but they couldn't erase the hollow ache she felt. Megan closed her eyes, letting herself drift, remembering Logan's smile, the fire, and the last words she'd promised to honor. By the next morning, word of the funeral had spread across the base and into local news. Photographs of Megan's collapse, surrounded by a sea of silent Marines, were circulating online, accompanied by stories of her bravery. Friends and former colleagues called, expressing pride, admiration, and disbelief that someone so young could demonstrate such valor. Despite the accolades, Megan couldn't focus on any of it. The news seemed distant, like it belonged to someone else. She didn't feel like a hero. She felt like a survivor, and survivors often carry more weight than applause can lift. Her phone buzzed incessantly. Messages from Marines she didn't know flooded in, veterans, recruits, officers, enlisted personnel, all sending notes of gratitude, prayers, and respect. Some simply said, "Semper Fi, you saved one of ours." One message stood out, an email from the base's commanding officer. It requested that Megan attend a special ceremony later in the week, a formal recognition with senior leadership and the extended Marine community present. The subject line was simple: "You represent all of us." The ceremony day arrived under clear blue skies, a sharp contrast to the foggy morning of the funeral. Megan's legs still ached, and her hands throbbed faintly from burns, but she dressed carefully, her uniform pristine. Each medal she pinned was a reminder of both her past service and the cost of the act that had become legend overnight. When she arrived at Camp Pendleton, the magnitude of the event became clear. A line of Marines stretched along the parade ground, standing at attention. Officers, veterans, and recruits alike formed a corridor. Reporters snapped photos, recording the moment for local television. Megan's eyes scanned the crowd. Faces she didn't know, faces she would never see again, all united in silent acknowledgement of what she had done. A quiet hum of reverence filled the air, not loud, not demanding, but insistent. The commanding officer approached, voice steady and measured. "Sergeant Holt," he said, "today we honor not just your courage, but the heart of what it means to be a Marine. You exemplified the highest standards, service before self, courage, and compassion. You saved a life and reminded every one of us why we serve." Megan felt her throat tighten. "Thank you, sir," she whispered, though words felt inadequate. The ceremony unfolded formally. Speeches, presentations, the reading of commendations, and finally, a moment where Megan was asked to address the assembly. She stepped forward, feeling every eye on her, every salute and nod, the quiet hum of anticipation. Her hands trembled slightly as she grasped the microphone. I didn't do this for recognition," she began, voice wavering. "I did it because that's what Marines do. We don't leave our own behind." Private Logan Reeves reminded me of why we keep standing, even when it's hard. He trusted me to act, and I promised him I would. And though he isn't here today, that promise remains. Every time I see a Marine, every time I hear the call to serve, I carry him with me. The crowd was silent, absorbed, some wiping away tears. For the first time, Megan allowed herself to feel the enormity of what had happened. Not just the act itself, but the ripples it created through the course, through the nation. When she finished speaking, applause echoed across the parade ground. It was respectful, measured, yet heartfelt. She lowered her gaze, thinking of Logan, imagining his smile, imagining him standing tall beside her as she had promised. After the ceremony, a group of senior Marines approached her. They asked for details she had barely spoken of before, how she had braved the flames, how she had navigated the wreckage, how she had refused to leave Logan behind. They nodded in solemn appreciation. Some of the younger recruits stared wide-eyed, taking in the reality that the stories of heroism they'd been told were not just legends. They had stood right here, in front of them. Her uniform felt heavy with weight, each medal and ribbon carrying memories she wasn't ready to share. Yet in that heaviness, there was pride, not the pride of fame, but of purpose fulfilled. One of the veterans, a retired sergeant, placed a hand on her shoulder. "You remind us what it means to be a Marine. Not all of us get to face fire and survive. You did, and we'll never forget." Megan nodded silently. Words failed her. Later that evening, as she walked through the quiet parade ground after the crowds had left, the wind carrying the faint scent of salt from the nearby coast, she paused. She glanced at the rows of buildings and training fields, realizing that the Marines she had saved, and those who had honored her, were all part of a chain, one long line of sacrifice, courage, and resilience. And then her phone buzzed again. This time it was Logan's mother. "Sergeant Holt," she said softly, voice trembling. "Thank you for everything. He was proud of you. And so am I." Megan's chest tightened. "I'm honored to have known him," she said. "I'll keep my promise, ma'am. Always." As she ended the call, Megan looked out over the horizon. The sun was dipping below the hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, the same colors that had burned the day she had pulled Logan to safety. She breathed in deeply, feeling the weight of loss and the power of memory. Somewhere in the quiet, she imagined him smiling at her, standing tall, as he had promised. And in that thought, she found a measure of peace. By nightfall, the base was silent. Megan returned to her quarters, exhausted but alert. She sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the medal Logan's mother had requested she keep for him, now in her possession, polished and gleaming. She held it tightly in her hand. "We'll both stand tall," she whispered, remembering his voice, the courage, and the unbreakable trust that had defined their final days together. And in that silence, she felt the echo of hundreds of Marines around her, the promise of family, honor, and a bond that death could not sever. It was more than recognition. It was legacy, and it was hers to carry. The morning air was crisp, almost painfully clear, when Megan Holt returned to Camp Pendleton for a personal visit to Logan Reeves's gravesite. Though the funeral had passed days ago, the ache in her chest was as fresh as the desert sun burning overhead. She moved slowly, careful of every step, her hands wrapped lightly in gauze. The weight of the medal Logan's mother had entrusted to her felt both comforting and unbearable in her palm. Her mind wandered back to the fire, the roar of the flames, the split-second decisions that had saved him. And now, the emptiness of his absence pressed down like a stone on her chest. She approached the headstone quietly, each step crunching on gravel. Her eyes found the crisp white lettering of Logan's name, the engraved words shining in the morning light. Private First Class Logan M. Reeves, United States, Marine Corps. The silence was profound, broken only by the faint rustle of wind through nearby palms. Megan knelt slowly, placing the medal atop the stone, the cool metal catching the sun. She whispered, "I kept my promise, Boot. I'll keep carrying it. You, me." U.S. For a long time, she simply stayed there, kneeling, staring at the headstone, lost in the swirl of grief and memory. Her chest tightened with each breath, and every thought circled back to the fire, to Logan's laugh, to his pleading eyes in the smoke. She barely noticed the approaching footsteps at first, the disciplined cadence of boots striking gravel with perfect precision. When she looked up, hundreds of Marines had formed a formation along the perimeter of the small cemetery. Officers, recruits, veterans, all standing at attention. Her heart caught in her throat. The sight was staggering. Each Marine's gaze was fixed forward, their salute poised, their discipline unbroken. For a moment, Megan thought she was dreaming. The commanding officer of Camp Pendleton stepped forward. "Sergeant Holt," he said quietly, his voice carrying across the hushed ranks, "you saved one of our own. Today, we honor you as he would have wanted. Stand with us as we honor both him and your courage." Megan's knees trembled. She tried to rise fully, to meet their salute, but the weight of exhaustion, grief, and adrenaline bore down. Her vision blurred, the world tipping around her. And then she collapsed. The ground came up to meet her like a soft, though unyielding, embrace. The metal slipped from her fingers, landing beside her, glinting in the sunlight. She felt hands, strong, steady, Marine hands, beneath her shoulders, lifting her slightly. But even with their support, the dizziness would not abate. Around her, the silent Marines remained in formation. Not a whisper, not a movement beyond the precise, disciplined posture of honor. It was in that silence, that deliberate, unbroken, almost sacred silence, that Megan felt the magnitude of what had happened. She had saved Logan's life. She had witnessed his courage. And now, as she knelt broken at his grave, the Corps itself had stepped in to uphold the promise she had made to him. One of the lieutenants knelt beside her, steadying her as the commander approached with the folded flag from Logan's funeral. He presented it to her, the same crisp folds, the same somber dignity, the same weight of love and loss. Megan's fingers closed around it automatically. She pressed it to her chest, trying to make sense of everything: the fire, the loss, the honor, and the thousand unspoken words etched into the faces of the Marines around her. The ceremony was wordless, but every gesture resonated. Boots aligned in perfect formation, hands raised in salute, eyes fixed forward, as if the collective spirit of the Corps itself had manifested in tribute. Megan could barely breathe under the enormity of it. Tears streamed freely now, carving paths along her soot-streaked face, but no one moved to comfort her. None were needed. The silence itself was comfort. A presence of hundreds of Marines, standing shoulder to shoulder, honoring a Marine lost and a Marine who saved, was more than words could convey. She thought of Logan, imagined his smile beneath the sun. "We stood tall," she whispered, voice barely audible. "I did it, Boot. I kept my promise." The commanding officer's voice finally broke the stillness, though it was quiet, deliberate, respectful. "Sergeant Holt, you have demonstrated courage, selflessness, and a devotion to your fellow Marines. It embodies the Corps' highest ideals. Today we honor you, not just for the life you saved, but for the example you have set for every Marine here and across the nation." Megan bowed her head, overwhelmed. Her body shook violently, her knees still weak from the collapse. And then she allowed herself to finally cry, openly, fully, without restraint. One by one, Marines stepped forward, filing past her in a silent procession. Each placed a hand briefly on her shoulder, a nod, a salute, or simply a glance that said, "We see you. We honor you." A young recruit hesitated at the end of the line, staring wide-eyed at the woman who had done the impossible. Megan looked up at him and smiled softly. "Keep going, Marine. You'll know when it's your turn to stand tall." He nodded, swallowing hard, then returned to formation. The sun rose higher, casting long shadows across the cemetery, illuminating the white headstones in stark relief. Megan felt the warmth on her face and imagined Logan standing beside her. She could almost hear his voice, faint above the hum of the wind. "You kept your promise." She clutched the medal and flag to her chest, feeling the weight of both grief and honor. It was more than recognition. It was validation, a tangible proof that what she had done mattered, not just to Logan, but to the entire Corps. As the Marines finally dispersed, the silence broke into soft, respectful murmurs. Megan was helped to her feet, still trembling, still holding the flag against her heart. She looked around at the rows of disciplined, proud faces, each one a reminder that courage was never solitary. And in that moment, she understood something profound. Heroism was not about medals, or news coverage, or public accolades. It was about the lives touched, the promises kept, and the silent honor of those who stand behind you, even when you feel alone. Megan closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and whispered one final word to Logan. "Semper Fi." The Marines returned the salute, though she was no longer in formation. It was understood without instruction. She was one of them, always. A sister in arms who had exemplified everything the Corps stood for. And at that moment, standing at the gravesite with the flag, the medal, and the echoes of a life saved and a life lost, Megan Holt finally felt the quiet power of honor, courage, and legacy. She had collapsed, but she had also risen. And in that rise, she was never truly alone. Days after the silent tribute, Megan Holt returned to her apartment, but nothing felt ordinary anymore. The quiet hum of her living space was a stark contrast to the precision, discipline, and reverence she had just witnessed at Logan Reeves's gravesite. Every object, every shadow, seemed to carry the weight of memory, the fire, the explosion, Logan's trembling hands, the medal she had pressed to her chest, and the thousands of Marines who had saluted her in perfect silence. She sat at her kitchen table, wrapped in her blanket, staring at the medal, the flag, and her dress blues still neatly folded on a chair. Her hands, though healing physically, trembled with the residue of emotion. The nights were hardest, when sleep refused to come, and the images of Logan's final moments replayed in her mind with unrelenting clarity. Her phone buzzed incessantly. Messages, calls, and emails from Marines across the country poured in, expressing gratitude, admiration, and solidarity. Many recounted personal stories, instances, when her courage had inspired them to act in moments of crisis, or to reconsider what it meant to be a Marine. Others simply said, "Semper Fi, Sergeant Holt. You embody the spirit of the Corps." Megan responded to a few, but mostly she read silently. The words brought pride, but also a deep ache. Heroism, she realized, was not a gift. It was a burden. One that required living with memories that would never fade. A week later, she received an invitation to a formal recognition ceremony in Washington. D.C., the President, along with the Secretary of Defense and the Commandant of the Marine Corps, would present her with the Navy and Marine Corps Medal, the same medal she had pressed into her hand at Logan's gravesite. She hesitated at first. Public recognition, crowds, cameras, these were foreign and uncomfortable to her. She had never sought attention. She had acted out of instinct, out of duty, not fame. But as she held the letter in her hands, she realized that Logan's story and the promise they had shared deserved more than personal silence. It deserved acknowledgement. When Megan arrived in Washington, the city's monuments loomed like silent witnesses to her arrival. She moved through the grand corridors of the Pentagon with measured steps, her uniform immaculate, her medals gleaming in the soft indoor light. The officials greeted her with the utmost respect, but she remained quiet, almost shy in the formal setting. The ceremony itself was both grand and intimate. Military brass played solemn tunes. The room hushed as the President began to speak. Sergeant Megan Holt exemplifies courage, selflessness, and valor in the face of life-threatening danger. Her quick thinking, bravery, and unwavering commitment to her fellow Marine saved a young man's life and inspired all who witnessed her actions. Today, we honor her not only for heroism, but for embodying the highest ideals of the United States Marine Corps. When the medal was placed around her neck, Megan felt the weight of it in her chest, heavy with history, honor, and the memory of Logan. The applause that followed was loud, thunderous, yet it felt oddly distant. She bowed her head, thinking of the young Marine she had saved and lost, imagining him standing beside her, tall and smiling. After the ceremony, she was approached by journalists, military historians, and even fellow veterans who wanted to hear the story firsthand. She recounted the events cautiously, careful to emphasize Logan's bravery, the importance of trust, and the bond between Marines. She never exaggerated, never dramatized. She let the facts and emotions speak for themselves. "What was going through your mind when you pulled him from the wreckage?" one reporter asked. Megan paused, eyes distant. "I didn't think," she said finally. "I acted. That's what Marines do. You act because someone else's life is in your hands. That's all." Her words were simple, but they carried the gravity of experience. Across the room, several young recruits nodded silently, taking in the reality of courage and sacrifice. Back at her apartment that evening, Megan reflected on everything that had happened over the past month. The fire, the rescue, Logan's recovery, his tragic passing, the funeral, the silent tribute, and now national recognition. The weight was immense, and yet, strangely, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't anticipated. She realized that heroism is not about medals or recognition. It is about moments, fleeting, precise, demanding absolute commitment, when one must choose to act despite fear, pain, or doubt. And those moments, once lived, ripple outward, touching lives in ways unseen. Her gaze fell on the medal once more, then to the folded flag, and finally to a photograph of Logan she had kept from the hospital. His freckles, his wide eyes, his determination, all of it reminded her that courage is not always loud. Sometimes it is quiet, intimate, and eternal. In the following weeks, Megan began volunteering at Camp Pendleton, working with young Marines fresh from training. She taught them not just tactics, but resilience, decision-making under pressure, and the importance of looking out for one another. Her experience became a lesson, not of personal glory, but of shared responsibility. One afternoon, while overseeing a simulated rescue exercise, a recruit froze in panic. Megan stepped forward calmly, guiding him through the situation, coaching him to act decisively. She watched as he gained confidence, recalling the fear and adrenaline she herself had felt months earlier. When the exercise concluded successfully, he saluted her. "Semper Fi, Sergeant Holt," he said, voice filled with admiration. "Semper Fi," she replied, feeling a quiet swell of pride. It wasn't Logan, but it was a continuation of his promise. She was standing tall, carrying forward his memory in every life she touched. Letters continued to arrive from across the country, veterans, civilians, and even school children. Many wrote about how her story inspired them to act courageously in their own lives, whether in service, in their communities, or simply in standing up for what is right. Megan read them all. Each letter was a reminder that heroism does not end in a single act. It is a chain reaction, a legacy of courage that extends far beyond the initial moment of danger. Logan's life and the promise they shared had created something enduring. For the first time, Megan felt that her grief and loss had a purpose. It was no longer only sorrow. It was memory, teaching, and example. At night, she would sometimes visit Logan's grave, kneeling and whispering stories of her day, updates on the recruits she had mentored, and the lives touched by his survival and sacrifice. "You'd be proud of them," she whispered one evening, the wind carrying her words across the cemetery. "I'm doing my best to stand tall, just like we promised." And somewhere in the quiet, Megan felt his presence, not tangible, but a warmth, a reminder that courage and sacrifice are never truly lost. They live in those who honor them, in the actions they inspire, and in the hearts of those left behind to carry the torch. Megan Holt's life would never return to its prior simplicity. She would never forget the fire, the young Marine who trusted her with his life, or the silent honor that hundreds of Marines had paid her. But she had learned something vital. Heroism is not about perfection. It is about showing up, making the choice to act, and keeping the promises that matter, even when no one is watching. And in standing tall, she realized she honored not only Logan Reeves, but every Marine who had ever risked everything for another. Her grief remained, yes, sharp, piercing, eternal. But it was tempered now with purpose, community, and a legacy that would not fade. She carried it with her like the medal at her chest, the flag in her hands, and the memory of Logan's wide eyes and quiet courage. Semper Fi, always faithful, always remembered. Months had passed since the silent tribute at Logan Reeves's gravesite, yet the memory lingered with Megan Holt, as vividly as the day it happened. The crisp desert air, the disciplined cadence of boots, the hum of respect, it all remained etched into her mind. Each time she thought of Logan, she felt both grief and a deep sense of purpose, a reminder that life's meaning often emerges from the moments we least expect. Her days had settled into a new rhythm. Training sessions with young Marines had become part of her routine. She relished watching the determination in their eyes, the flicker of courage that mirrored the resolve she had once seen in Logan's gaze. She reminded them constantly that heroism is not measured in medals, but in the decisions to act when it matters most. One afternoon, after overseeing a rigorous obstacle course, Megan paused to watch the recruits push past fatigue and fear. A young private stumbled, his frustration clear, but she guided him patiently, steadying his hands and offering encouragement. "You can do this," she said softly, her voice firm but warm. Courage isn't about being fearless. It's about standing tall despite fear. The private nodded, his confidence renewed, and Megan felt a quiet satisfaction. Logan's promise, their shared vow to stand tall, echoed in every Marine she mentored. Her story had begun to reach beyond the base. Military publications ran articles highlighting her heroism. Civilian newspapers and online platforms shared her account, framing her as a model of bravery and selflessness. Letters continued to arrive from veterans and civilians alike, some thanking her for reminding them of courage, others sharing how her actions inspired them to face their own fears. Megan read every letter carefully. She did not seek recognition, yet each message reinforced the weight and importance of what she had done. She had acted instinctively, yet the ripples of her courage extended far beyond that single moment. One particularly heartfelt letter came from a young Marine stationed overseas. He wrote about facing a dangerous mission, hesitating in the heat of action, and recalling Megan Holt's story to summon the strength to act decisively. "Your courage saved more than one life," he concluded. "It saved countless Marines through inspiration." Megan folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer, feeling both humbled and reassured. She realized that heroism is rarely solitary. Its impact often travels further than the immediate act. Despite public recognition and professional validation, grief remained a constant companion. At night, she would sit by Logan's photograph, medal and folded flag beside her, and speak quietly to the young Marine she had saved and lost. "I keep my promise, Boot," she whispered, tracing the edges of his smiling face. "Every time I see a Marine succeed, every time someone remembers your bravery, I'm standing tall for you." The words provided a measure of comfort. It was a silent conversation, a dialogue of memory, honor, and legacy. Logan's courage and trust had transformed her own grief into purpose, and that purpose guided her every day. Her commanding officers noticed the transformation in her. Megan had always been capable and disciplined, but her recent experiences had honed her into a leader whose presence inspired trust, focus, and resilience. She was offered opportunities to advance in rank and to serve in higher advisory roles, yet she chose to remain close to the recruits, to continue shaping young Marines at the moment they needed guidance most. Her approach to mentorship became something of a model program. Emphasis on courage, mental resilience, and teamwork was woven into training modules. Veterans invited her to speak at symposiums and military academies, where she shared her story not as a tale of personal glory, but as a lesson in commitment, instinct, and standing for others. Every story she told, every lesson she imparted, carried Logan's spirit with it. She had learned that heroism is more than a single act. It is the continuous cultivation of courage, the teaching of resilience, and the living of values that honor those who came before. One late evening, Megan walked the base quietly, the sun dipping behind the hills and casting long shadows over the parade ground. The world was calm, almost serene, yet the memory of the fire, the collapse, and Logan's trust lingered. She paused at a small training field, imagining the young private she had once saved standing tall beside her. In her mind, she saw the rows of silent Marines at the gravesite, boots firm, salutes unbroken, eyes solemn yet full of unspoken recognition. That moment, the stillness, the honor, had changed her forever. It had shown her that courage, when recognized and honored, creates a chain of inspiration. Megan bent down, touching the ground lightly. "I'm still standing," she whispered. "For you. For them. For all of us." Years later, Megan Holt's story became part of Marine Corps' history, not merely as a tale of a heroic rescue, but as an enduring example of values lived, courage shared, and legacy carried forward. Recruits would study the story in training, officers would reference it in speeches, and veterans would retell it at reunions. The narrative was not about medals, cameras, or fame. It was about trust, duty, and the profound impact of one individual choosing to act in the face of life and death. And though Logan Reeves was gone, his presence remained in every lesson she taught, in every young Marine who grew stronger under her guidance. And in the silent moments when courage demanded action, Megan often returned to Logan's grave, each visit both private and sacred. She would kneel, place a single flower or a small token of remembrance, and speak quietly of her day, the lives she touched, the victories of the Marines she mentored, and the ways she continued to honor the promise they had shared. "You'd be proud," she whispered. "I'm still standing tall." Her final reflection was simple but profound. Heroism is not about recognition or accolades. It is about choosing to act when it matters, embracing responsibility, honoring trust, and carrying forward the legacy of those who inspire us. Megan Holt's journey had begun with an act of courage in the heat of fire and chaos. It continued through grief, recognition, mentorship, and legacy. And ultimately, it became a story of enduring strength, of standing tall, even when the world seems unbearably heavy, and honoring those who trust you to do just that. As she stood once more on the parade ground, medal gleaming, flag folded, and heart full, Megan Holt felt the quiet, resolute presence of hundreds of Marines at her side, standing silent, unwavering, in eternal tribute. And for the first time in a long while, she smiled through her tears. She had kept her promise. She had truly stood tall.